The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Sufi Thought and Action by Idries Shah. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Key Concepts in Sufi Understanding. Edited by Professor Hafiz Jamal. Those Astonishing Sufis. Adilbai Karkovli. The great decade of interest and experiment, featuring Eastern religions and strange practices, has come and gone, leaving a curious detritus of beliefs, myths, practices, and disillusioned seekers after knowledge, scattered from California to Kathmandu. It has fulfilled two obvious functions, things ranging from vegetarianism to mystical chants, formerly the preserve of odd local cults and weird societies of often less than balanced people, have become known to a tremendous mass of people. The new fads, like flying saucers, have been linked with the old ones, like ancient Chinese fortune-telling books. Imitation Indians, both Hindu and Redskin, are still to be found. Books on magic and miracles sell by the 100,000. And, as a perhaps beneficial spin-off, many cults have been exposed for what they are, very often groups which attract the unbalanced and unbalance those prone to such directions. Reading the literature and talking to a wide variety of thinking people, one sees that a single facet of this explosion of interest has been the most dramatic, yet the most elusive. This is the revelation, to the people of the East and the West, of the riches of investigation and experience locked within the literature and practices of a body of people who have been called, for the past 1,500 years, the Sufis. Nobody knows when or where this movement started. Its foremost theoreticians give such varying answers to the question that there can now be little doubt that they deliberately confuse any effort to trace their knowledge further than they want it to go. We know the names and much about the lives and doings of an astonishing number and variety of their sages, from Spain and Morocco to India, from what is now the Soviet Union to the middle of Africa. But as soon as you try to piece together exactly what they are doing and why, and how, you come across insuperable obstacles. Theirs undeniably is a secret which is kept in the most effective of all ways, by showing themselves and then proliferating their materials to such an extent that the conventional thinker or researcher will be unable to find characteristic traces from which he can deduce a general theory. There are many people who take this variety and depth as the evidence of the authenticity of the endeavor. Certain it is that there is no other community which has been able to operate in this way, for all others have been compelled by social and other pressures to ossify their dogmas and to declare their principles, often in so narrow a way as to proclaim their limitations to an almost laughable extent. But experience of true Sufi groups does reveal that the things which other systems regard as primary, central, are found among the Sufis as peripheral or transitory, secondary. This idea, again, is so startling and indeed so beguiling that some have found in it a proof of the legitimacy of the Sufi approach. The Sufis themselves say that all true systems started by the use, by a skilled individual, of rituals and methods which were applied as required. Almost all of them, they continue, degenerate into mimes. Among them are the majority of the spiritual systems known at the present day, as well as traditional medicine, ideologies, and social institutions. Concealment and elective operation, then, may be taken as the hallmarks of the Sufi. What have they in common which might help us to make a link? Well, if it is true that the Sufi has a skill which has to be exercised in accordance with conditions and the state of his pupil, it would seem likely that he would conceal a great deal from that pupil's curiosity for information about origins and so on. If, say, a surgeon were to operate upon you, or a doctor prescribe a treatment, neither would encourage your interfering with the process by constant inquiries about the history of his skill. That this is the probable basis of much of the Sufi mystery seems probable when we look at what the Sufis themselves say about it. Sufism, they say, is activity, not theory. This activity, they continue, can take almost any form. Sufi activity familiar to a vast and growing audience is found in the form of tales told by Sufis. They may appear didactic, cautionary, or humorous, or downright mysterious. A study of these tales and what Sufis themselves say about them reveals, however, something which is seldom suspected. People try to use them in customary ways, to penetrate their meaning or to allow them to act on them, or to relate them to something already known, and so on, but their use is otherwise. The tales are there to prepare the mind for further understanding, not to give any understanding which the pupil can perceive, and they are also designed, especially in the Mass, to baffle in part, so that the learner will admit that he cannot understand, and will therefore apply to the teacher for real teaching. They are, in this latter role, the goad which takes the individual to the teacher. Thus, the Sufi story is designed to help overcome unperceived assumptions. The assumption in most cases is that the learner can learn unaided. Similarly, Sufi assignments, whether they be manual labor or working on exercises, contain the element least suspected by the student, the one whereby he comes to a realization that perception comes beyond activity. When Sufis report results of enterprises, spiritual exercises, formulae, or even doing gardening chores for their master, it is to be noted that these developments do not come during the activity, but invariably after it. This is underlined by hints from Sufi sources that the ordinary self, as experienced by most people, stands in the way of self-realization. Only a fatiguing of this secondary self makes it possible for the subtler impulses to be perceived by the primary self, and then only when this is done as a part of a program planned and carried out by a real teaching master, not by imitation. Sufi stories and Sufi activities, therefore, both contain the effective function of blocking the working of the would-be analytical mind and the grosser self, as a preparation for higher insight. These conceptions, the Sufis aver, lie at the root of all genuine traditions. But as in the case of the deterioration into ritualism already noted, they have become ossified by tradition in all other systems to mere repetition, disguised entertainment, and emotionality. Sufi mystery attracts people with an overdeveloped taste for it, as the Sufis themselves admit. They insist, however, that the fact of mystery brings out this proclivity and enables the Sufi to diagnose it and consequently to subtract such people from his following. Read any collection of real Sufi stories, and you will see how frequently this is done. Again, the instrumental function of Sufi literature, when revealed, annoys a large proportion of superficialists, and this in turn helps the Sufi to shed them by performing what is nowadays called aversion therapy. The effect of fanaticism to destroy a person's sense of humor is well known. The Sufis make use of this, too, in their insistence that those interested in their way should study and understand jokes and humorous recitals. This causes useless people, the kind of mind which cannot really approach the Sufi truth, to shun the Sufis, thus pleasing both parties. Self-realization is the Sufi goal. What is this self and how is it realized? First, the Sufis are operating in the field of religion, which means that they are committed to belief in a meaning for human life, the existence of a divine power, and a transmission of the knowledge of that meaning, that power, and certain opportunities for mankind. It has been said that there is no human community yet known which has no religious system. Certain it is that everyone who comes across the Sufi activity in any form will relate it to what he or she already assumes to be religion, or more likely, the real religion. A study of the words and doings of the Sufis, however, seems to show that they will at one point appear to be supporting the local religious expression, and at another opposing it. The confusion arises simply because the Sufis are teaching, not promoting beliefs. Where their teaching accords with local beliefs, they will appear to support these. Where it deviates, it will appear to oppose the religious structure of belief. The Sufis themselves are frequently on record as teaching in this vein, though their attitude is generally expressed in terms which were better understood in the past. As an example, the phrase, Sufism is the inner aspect of religion, can quite easily be seen as meaning Sufi teachings, over a period of time, become covered by social, emotional, and other accretions which are stabilized into religions. The living tradition of the Sufis, however, continues. Viewed from the religionist's standpoint, of course, the Sufi element is the inward component, and the rest is the balance of the religion. But even more succinctly, the Sufi is saying, Sufism is a teaching designed to re-establish a link of humanity with the divine. From time to time, this is revitalized when religious systems have become too covered with accretions to operate as teaching entities, and have subsided into organizations of social action, power-seeking, or mere panoply. The emphasis is strongly to be noted in the words of a Sufi who has said, the harmonization of the inward part of humanity, the real self, with the ultimate truth, is actually disturbed when the social or emotional activity becomes too strong. The coarse drives out the finer. Hence, when the Sufi says, people do not want to learn, they want to feel, he is referring to this degenerative trend, the dilution of the spiritual dimension by too much sentiment, ritualism, and so on. He does not mean that people should not feel and should learn instead. He means that feeling is not learning, and that people should at some point arrive at the capacity to distinguish between them. Seen in this way, the Sufi analysis of human confusion and lack of awareness of perception being distinct from emotion is so very modern in tone that it has both been misunderstood in the past and not even caught up with in the present. Sufis have been regarded as promoters of generosity as a virtue because they decry miserliness. But few observers have noted that the Sufi encouragement of generosity is a means to an end, not an end in itself. The end is that, in Sufi assertion, miserliness is harmful to deeper perceptions. Generosity is the way leading to a development of much higher capacity. Generosity has a social and emotional value. Beyond it lies a spiritual triumph. Introducing such a concept, reintroducing it would be a better term, among contemporary human communities where it is believed that doing good is a key to heaven, not a way of opening a path to understanding, is an uphill task and not one which is rewarded by the community or its institutions. All societies, including modern and free ones, have their blinkers. There is no law or secret police which prevents people from examining such options as the Sufis offer. There is an even more effective mechanism, that of the culture itself, which offers no inducement to look at things with which it has almost never concerned itself. It cannot be denied that the Sufis have a defensible point of view when they say that the norms, customs, and principles which are commonly employed to establish and to maintain human communities may have their limitations. It is a commonplace to observe the ultimately destructive effect of principles carried to excess, even to extremes. As a contemporary Sufi puts it, the difference between a Democrat and a Sufi is that the Democrat says, with Winston Churchill, democracy is not perfect, but it is the best system which we have, while the Sufi says, keep it if it works, but work your very hardest to find the perfect, otherwise you are a disguised pessimist. Since all other human associations depend for their ultimate effect and solidity upon the community spirit and transference of emotions from one person to another, people who join Sufi groups soon find themselves disorientated. At first they may find friends, and are then told that the purpose of the group includes not avoiding friendship, but realizing its limitations so that something higher may be attained. Only too often they find this very hard to understand. Like the Democrats, they have been taught that there is nothing higher than friendship. The effect of this belief, unsupported though it may be, is to regard anyone questioning it as attacking the institution itself. But the Sufi, to quote another master, is in reality saying, friendship is certainly needed and wonderful, but its place in higher perceptions is another matter. One student who spent many years among Sufis in the East and the West has noted that members often complain that they never seem to get anywhere. It was 3 decades before he discovered that those who do indeed get somewhere always say that they have not learned anything. The reason for this is not to disturb those still waiting to be selected for special training, those not yet ripe. In the past, it has been assumed that Sufis say that there is nothing to be gained from Sufism to deter curiosity mongers or to discourage unsuitable applicants. The real reason, however, is mainly to preserve the laggards from anxiety which disturbs their concentration. There are, it is true, Sufis who go by the name of Malamati, the people of blame, who deliberately incur opprobrium and bad reputations so as to avoid the invasion of hypocrites and poseurs, and sometimes, too, to have their resilience tested. But these are a different case. Another revelation about the Sufis recently recorded by an investigator renders many outsiders' opinions and assessments of them virtually useless. This is the study, made by Alexander Dixon, of the Sufis' habit of attacking fixed ideas. People hear and read of Sufis opposing this opinion or that, removing or assailing beliefs and practices so that the onlookers assume that the Sufi in question is against this religion or that, this person or that one, this idea or that. But a close examination of the content of the words and actions of a number of Sufis over a long period revealed that the attacks served to soften up the fixations, reduce the dependence upon prejudice and ingrained affirmation on many levels and diverse directions, which themselves render minds inflexible and inefficient. Very often this technique is carried out in a shock manner, when the most dearly loved assumptions of the student are contradicted head-on. Many devices are employed to cause this effect. Sufi jokesters, conjurers, and even snake handlers defy reason by applying a shock through their performances, thus liberating congealed attention, which has all but paralyzed the effective mentation of the victims. This procedure is so little known in most societies that it is in general confined by interest groups to purveying their own contradictions of others' beliefs. The Sufis take it to the degree of a fine art. In doing so, of course, many of them have gained reputations as mischief makers or irrationals. This is because someone who is opposing a belief which is greatly cherished gets the former name, and someone who seems to contradict himself from one moment to another, the latter. Of one eminent contemporary Sufi, for instance, it is often said that he cannot make up his mind whether he likes or dislikes a certain book, whether he is for or against certain prejudices. People simply have not noticed that he is working against fixations wherever he finds them. His own opinions are not involved. For this latter reason, of course, Sufis have been called objective, though few people seem to realize the extent to which this objectivity is carried on. The Sufis, then, are quite astonishing in their behavior and supposed ideas if they are looked at from conventional or even from unlikely points of view. You can only understand what the Sufis are doing if you have the requisite perception, or, in a smaller way, information. To summarize, we can only examine their activities with any hope of success if we note that they are not interested in externals, and if we remember that externals are the major source of stimulus to most other people. Again, we have to accept that they claim that emotional stimulus has a place, and that that place is not always where we, from custom and training, imagine it to be. Thirdly, our fixation on history or personalities is held by Sufis to be a barrier to understanding, if carried too far, and they show quite clearly that they hold that we do carry it too far, thus attenuating the chances of our own progress. Further, the idea of elective operation. Teaching people at the right time and place and in the right manner and company, with its corollary that teaching may take almost any form, these items are so far removed from the mechanical approach to religion and cults within our civilization that it may well be beyond the grasp of most people to visualize such a system without a great effort. The question of Sufi tales and other literature as containing a preparation ingredient and not simply being there to produce belief or disbelief, not there for cultural colouring, not there for their externals. These concepts require a good deal of digesting before even the most intelligent individual can take advantage of whatever dynamic they might contain. The employment of certain techniques, such as frustrating the intellectual approach, or increasing bafflement to focus attention upon the teacher and his ability to point the way, these are aspects of Sufi operation which, even in a modern sophisticated society, we have not yet learnt to handle. As for the contention that real and higher perceptions come after carrying on activities, and not necessarily as part and parcel of them, this needs the most careful attention. The function of mystery to cause mystery-minded people to reveal themselves and hence make it possible for them to be dealt with is more readily understandable and probably provides one of the paths to understanding the Sufi mentality. Similar techniques, for instance in eliciting forms of behavior in order to study their bases, exist in modern psychology, however unexpected it may be to encounter them in ancient lore like that of the Sufis. The equation of humour with frivolity and hence lack of seriousness is more difficult for us to understand. But if it is true that our culture has lost its way in labelling humour as superficial or unimportant, we shall have to understand it sooner or later. The contention about re-establishing a contact between a human real self and the divine is also easy enough for us to grasp in theory, though the realization that what we have assumed to be the major self might in fact turn out to be at least in part a social artifact, might be more difficult to swallow even theoretically for members of a culture that at least until recently has assumed that it is superior to all others precisely because it has taken such an interest in this secondary self as the primary aspect of man. That teaching is different from promoting beliefs is a well-known concept in modern culture, and the Sufis should have little difficulty in persuading us of its importance. The only problem here is that our way of thinking, while admitting that teaching should be free from bias, inwardly insists that this does not apply in religion. This startling evidence of internalized regulation has not yet been absorbed by Western society, though it has been pointed out often enough during the past few decades. The conception that Sufism is the inner component of religion, too, should be acceptable enough if it is seen from enough examples that religion is often mainly an accretion of superficialities around an ancient core which may be reclaimed. But the corollary, that social and emotional activity actually disturbs higher perceptions, is unlikely to pass unchallenged, especially by those who believe themselves to be imbibing spirituality with every prayer or operatic aria. Naturally, such people will be less likely to assail this contention than to ignore it, to the detriment of future valuable research on the subject. The much-repeated theory, for we can see it only on that level until it is verified by experience, that virtues are not keys to heaven but essential steps which clear the way to higher understanding, is perhaps the most attractive of all the Sufi statements. There has always been, both in the East and the West, an uneasiness about believing that something done from fear or hope should be rewarded by paradise, or that ordinary human duties, carried out even by the most primitive peoples, should be represented as things which a highly evolved religious system proclaims as part of advanced religious thinking. This involves, of course, rethinking many of the values to see whether they are not, indeed, pitched at too low a level, rather than, as fashionable theoreticians affirm, too high. The best that we have in institutions may be insufficient, not a matter for self-congratulation. This applies to the various forms of human relationship which have been in the past regarded as sublime, but which research might well show to confirm the Sufi claim that they are valuable, but only on a lower level. The Sufi habit of dissimulation, I haven't learnt anything, does take some integrating into our way of thought, even if only because the book-bound individual, the theorist and historian, will now have to re-examine his materials to determine whether something was indeed said at some time, because it represented the beliefs or feelings of someone, or whether it was said for another reason. But we can only gain if we find in the end that people whom we imagine to be contradicting themselves were only shifting ground to look at things from different perspectives, or only attacking fixed ideas which, surely, we are united in realizing to be of increasing peril to the human race.
This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.